Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today to talk about digital accessibility and disability inclusive research. I'm Kurt Murmurs. I work in ITS as a digital accessibility analyst, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about my favorite topic of digital accessibility and to think about how that might apply to the work that you all do. So, for today's agenda, I want to talk a little bit about what is digital accessibility, why is it important, why are we talking about it today, how might you apply digital accessibility best practices in the context of research and the work that you do? Um, how to put digital accessibility principles into practice in general, and also explore some resources where you can learn a lot more about this and also get some help and support to make things accessible. So let's start with talking about what digital accessibility is. We can talk about some definitions for what that means, how it relates to diverse experiences of disability, and what some of the standards and principles are that guide this type of work. In the broadest sense, digital accessibility means that digital information and experiences can be accessed, participated in, understood, and made use of by everyone. It's just not just about making those things available, but about equitable access, which means removing barriers or burdens that are often placed on either specific people or specific communities as a whole. And the way that we achieve this a lot of times is by implementing specific standards and practices that center the needs of people with disabilities and, most importantly, reflect the lived experience of people with disabilities. So, this is a really very broad way of looking at it. We're going to get into some of the details of what this actually looks like in practice. But I also want to talk about what digital accessibility applies to, what we're talking about when we talk about digital information or the digital world. Um, and it includes a really wide range of things. I'm sure you all can think of more examples than we have on this slide, but it includes things like web content, websites, web applications, mobile applications, any of those things that are created by a vendor or a third party that we are using or licensing, electronic documents. So that would be things like Word documents, Google Docs, PDFs, slides. It also includes things like video or multimedia content that's shared online, social media posts, emails, and lots more things. Um, and it doesn't apply so much to like a private email you're sending to your colleague, but it does apply to all of these things when they're shared with a larger audience. It is not possible to talk about digital accessibility without talking about experiences of disability. Although sometimes people try, I think we can get caught up in the, the technical standards that we have to meet to make something accessible. But it's important to think that we do all of these things based on people's real lived experience of disability, which is incredibly common. It's something that probably all of us will experience at some point in our lifetime. And according to the CDC, at any given time, at least 1 in 4 adults in the US have a disability. It's probably an underestimation. And there's a huge diversity of the types of disability that people experience. So when we think about making something accessible, it's important to think about the wide range of experiences and needs that people might have. So it includes thinking about auditory disabilities, such as for folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, cognitive disabilities, anything in the huge range of neurodivergence, speech, language, and communication disabilities, visual disabilities, motor or mobility disabilities, seizures, vestibular disorders, and probably lots more things not listed here. Um, and even within these different sort of categories, people experience their disabilities in a huge range of ways. Um, there, it might be apparent or not apparent to you whether or not someone is disabled, so avoiding making assumptions about that, and also understanding that people might experience a disability for their whole life, chronically, on a temporary basis, or even potentially just in a situation where the specific circumstances can be disabling. All of us have different access needs, which are just the circumstances or conditions that we need to be able to access, use, or participate in something. And that might change with some of our different specific circumstances or experiences. Um, so it's just important to recognize that disabled people are everywhere in the world and everywhere here at U of M in our work and in our research. And most of the digital world is still really inaccessible. And people with disabilities who are the most impacted by that. Um, and so, just for an example of what I mean by really inaccessible, in 2024, it was found that the top 1 million homepages on the top 1 million most visited websites had at least 95.9% of them had at least one failure, according to accessibility standards. So these issues are really prevalent. Something that we talk a lot about in the realm of digital accessibility is assistive technology. Assistive technology could be a device, a piece of software, or a feature that lets someone accomplish their goal. And it's usually designed around a specific need that's not met by conventional tech. We'll put that in big quotation marks. Um, some examples of things that are considered assistive technology would be something like a screen reader. So for someone who is blind, they might use a screen reader which can transform what we would see as the visual output on a computer screen or on a mobile device screen, and either turn that into auditory output or into braille output. It includes things like speech recognition, so just using speech to manage controls or to type text. It also includes text to speech, for some folks for whom it's easier to process listening to something auditorily but not reading it. Things like screen magnifiers for people who may have low vision who can benefit from the screen being enlarged. And we can think of lots of other examples. I do have a link on this slide if you would like some more information about assistive technology at U of M more broadly. And I'll be sure to share the link for these slides as well. So why is all of this important? There are a lot of different reasons why. We'll get into some of them, including just the impact here at U of M as a whole, some of the relevant laws, regulations, and policies that apply broadly here and might apply very specifically to your work. And we'll also talk about some of the unique applications that digital accessibility might have in the context of doing research. So here at U of M, we think about digital accessibility as a way to make sure that the greatest number of people in our community can access and use our content, our events, our research output, all kinds of different things. It's important also for ourselves, for making sure that staff are supported and that we can recruit and retain talented disabled staff that we have across the university. It's important for supporting our mission toward creating an inclusive environment, toward creating services that serve the public good as a public university, and also in leading the way in global efforts towards digital accessibility and its broad impacts. We do have a specific U of M digital accessibility policy, and that is SPG 601.20. That's our official electronic and information technology, or EIT accessibility. And this policy sets us to a specific standard for web accessibility called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. And we'll come back in a minute to what those mean. But the policy ensures that people with disabilities have equitable access to all of the things happening in the digital world at U of M. And it has three main focus areas. So one is the procurement of electronic and information technology. So anything that we're purchasing is required to meet our standards, even if it's developed by an outside vendor. We're focused on internal development and content creation and making anything that we're building here in-house accessible. And it also has a third policy area that's focused on the provision of assistive technology, which is used by people at U of M to access digital content. This applies to the entire university, all campuses, and is a collective responsibility, with the exception of students, to adopt this and continue to work towards aligning with the policy. There are also some specific laws and regulations relating to digital accessibility that apply to all of our work and may apply specifically to some of your work in different ways. So the first one is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal civil rights law designed to protect the rights of and prevent discrimination against people with disabilities. It outlines the requirements for organizations like U of M to achieve accessibility and to prevent discrimination across a wide range of activities. There was just an update last year to Title II of the ADA regulations that requires all digital content and applications provided by U of M to be accessible according to this same standard, WCAG 2.1 AA, referenced by our policy. And it also set in motion a compliance deadline for this of April 2026. So we've been doing a lot of work as part of our digital accessibility strategic initiative, which I'll share some more resources about toward meeting this specific obligation. Other laws and regulations that apply in this sphere include Section 4 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was a precursor to the ADA, and is still used in many cases, specifically pertaining to agencies that receive federal funding, such as universities that receive public funding. There is also Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, which specifically covers healthcare providers, such as Michigan Medicine, and prohibits discrimination, including based on disability in health programs and activities. So these are some of the laws and regulations that apply to us. I'm just sort of referencing them broadly, not as legal advice, but if this is something you would like to learn more about, and or if you have specific questions about how these might apply to your work, I would advise reaching out either to the Disability Equity Office or to the Office of General Counsel, and I will provide their contact information at the end of this presentation as well. In addition to these guidelines, you might also find that in the context of research, there are specific requirements that might be based on the requirements of specific grant-making agencies, for example. And you might find that these are pretty variable. They might have specific compliance requirements related to some of the laws that I just mentioned, such as Section 508, Section 504, or ADA, or might set their own internal standard for a version of WCAG. And it might apply to different parts of the work, such as the data itself, the publication of it, products or programs related to it. Specific publishers might have unique guidelines. And you also might find that if anything, a service or distribution is happening somewhere outside of the United States, that other countries might have more unique guidelines. Some places actually have much more stringent guidelines than the United States for digital accessibility. You might also find that you're required to provide specific documentation or supporting evidence about the accessibility of something, such as a VPAT. It stands for a Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that type of documentation is and how to find it and understand it a little bit. Laws and regulations that we discussed here are obviously really important in meeting our obligations, but they're not the only reason that it's important to make things accessible. And that is also true in the context of research. There are a lot of different reasons that we can think about that make it important to consider accessible study design. Um, and just to mention a few of these, like um, we have some evidence that people with disabilities are often either implicitly or explicitly excluded from health research, in spite of them often being the folks who might have the most potential benefit from that research. And explicit ways can include specific exclusion criteria, but the implicit ways that we exclude disabled people from research include a lot of the things that we're talking about here today in the digital realm. So that might include digital recruitment materials that aren't accessible, um, surveys or other parts of the process that are not accessible that just implicitly exclude people without us thinking about it. And there are a lot of problems with this, including potentially limiting the generalizability of these findings and disabled people being able to benefit from that research. So there are a lot more things to think about in this area. In this slide, we've linked 3 specific resources that I would definitely recommend you check out if you want to learn more, both about thinking about accessible study design just in general, but also in learning a little bit more about the benefits of that and why this is vitally important. With that said, I want to shift gears to talking a little bit about putting digital accessibility practices into place. So I want to give you some more information about some of the basic principles that guide digital accessibility work, give some examples of what that might look like in your work, and think a little bit more about how to apply all of this information. So we've mentioned a couple times here that there are some different standards that guide our accessibility work, specifically the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, or WCAG 2.1, which I have linked from this slide. You can use some of these guidelines, and I'll provide some additional resources too, right? Like if you open these actual guidelines, can be a little bit tricky to parse out how this might apply to your work. But we have some great resources that can help you think about accessible design in general. It can be really helpful to think about accessibility from the start so that you're not scrambling later to go back and make something accessible, so that you're not accidentally excluding folks, as we were just talking a little bit about. There are a lot of great reasons for this, even if it still means providing specific accommodations later. Um, and on some of the resources that you might be using, you can also um, do some quick tests to see if things are accessible if it's not something you built. So I'll share out the link for a resource on this slide, which is called the Quick Non-Technical Accessibility Tests. We are not going to have time to go through all of that today, but this is something I would definitely recommend you take a look at if you have a spare 10 minutes, and just pick a resource, pick a website that you use frequently, and try and go through these tests. I think it'll be really informative in thinking about like taking a critical lens and looking at whether or not something is accessible. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are organized by some specific guiding principles. And so without having to get into the nitty gritty details of everything that's in WCAG, I really think that understanding what these principles are can also provide a really helpful framework in thinking about whether or not something is accessible. So the way that WCAG is organized is there are 4 main principles, and then each principle has their own specific guidelines, success criteria, and different techniques to meet those criteria. But the 4 main principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, spelling out the acronym POUR, P-O-U-R. So the first principle is perceivable or easy to perceive. And this means that it can be accessed regardless of what someone's senses are. So that means whether someone is using sight, sound, touch, or speech to access information or input information. So, for example, someone who's blind who can't see an image on a screen may use a screen reader. a form of assistive technology, which can't inherently understand what an image is. So there needs to be a text description of that image called alternative text that a screen reader can then read aloud or turn into Braille output. Another example, someone who's deaf might not be able to hear the sounds in a video, so you can provide captions, which creates a visual way of receiving the same information. So that's perceivable. The next principle is operable, meaning that all of the functions are available to someone regardless of how they're operating technology or what technology they're using. So whether someone might be using a keyboard or a mouse or a mobile device or voice input or some combination of these different things, they'll be able to perform different tasks. So for example, being able to fill out a survey while you're using voice commands. The next principle is understandable or easy to understand, which means being understandable in both its content and its format. So that includes thinking of things like predictable design. Is it predictable the way you navigate around something? Are you using clear, understandable language? Are you providing feedback if someone makes an error on how to correct that or how to understand what's expected for them? So things like using common words and ordering things in a logical way are all examples of this. The last principle is robust. You can also think about this as ongoing compatibility. So it means that something works consistently over time with different technology, like different operating systems, different web browsers. Most of the meaning of this is about using valid formats, valid use of different programming languages to create digital technologies. So those are the core principles. And just starting with these, you can start to think about how these might apply to different areas of the work that you're doing. I want to talk through some examples of what this actually might look like in practice. So just first and foremost, we talk about the importance of including lived experience of disabled people in your work. So thinking about how you can get feedback and include people with disabilities in your study design or creation of materials. And then it might include some really practical things like writing instructions in plain language and using a plain language checker or guides to make sure that you're writing things clearly and concisely. It might include adding captions to video content. It might mean ensuring that there are multiple ways that someone can contact you, such as via phone, email, and chat. It might be thinking about the visual design of materials you're using, such as using good color contrast and good color combinations on a web page or on a social media post that will be visible for people who have low vision or who are colorblind. It might mean thinking about your survey inputs and can someone complete that if they're using voice controls or if they're using a screen reader on their phone. And then it might include things like providing descriptions or providing data tables alongside things like data visualizations to make sure that people have multiple ways of understanding what that information is. So some things you'll be able to think about and plan for designing accessibly yourself, but of course, all of us use a lot of tools that are created by external developers or vendors. And whenever we're purchasing, contracting, or just adopting using that product, it's really important to think about the accessibility of that product. And there's a few things that you can do in this process. So the first one, and probably the area where we have the most control, is if you're purchasing a product, if you're going through an RFP, you can consider using accessibility requirements language in your contract. This is probably the most critical moment where we have actual leverage to make sure that whatever we're purchasing is accessible to start with, or that we can hold the creator of that content accountable for ensuring its accessibility in the future. You can also ask the vendor for compliance documentation. So that can be information about their product that tells you how accessible it is, whether they've done accessibility testing, what are known limitations or features of it. And some types of documentation for that include HECVAT or the VPAT, that voluntary product accessibility template. And we have some guidance linked from this slide about what those documents are, how to ask for them, and also how to understand them. But you can also ask for more information outside of the compliance documentation, such as, do they have an accessibility roadmap? Do they have dedicated accessibility staff? Do they have known resources about the accessibility features of their tool or product, or ways that they know are accessible or less accessible to use it? So we're actually creating some updated resources right now to help guide folks along the process of procurement and working with vendors. So please feel free to check those out, and also stay tuned for some updates that'll hopefully make those resources a little bit more clear and usable in thinking about how to assess the accessibility of external resources. So we just sort of skimmed the surface today of thinking about what digital accessibility is and the basics of starting to think about that in the context of your own work. But I want to provide some additional resources that you can use to get started and learn a lot more about this, and also how and who you can reach out to for help. So the first thing I'd recommend is to check out the U of M Digital Accessibility website, which includes a pretty robust section of how-to guides that can apply accessibility principles to a lot of different scenarios and types of digital content that you might be working with. We also have 2 Canvas courses that you might find interesting, including our Introduction to Digital Accessibility course, which is a longer, more detailed intro to this topic. And then we also have a digital accessibility training hub, which has a number of shorter modules that are concrete steps on how to work with specific format types, such as documents, PDFs, web content, presentations, and a bunch of other things. I also mentioned we currently have a digital accessibility strategic initiative going on, which is a multi-year project to support digital accessibility across the university. And you can learn a lot more about that on our website as well. And we would also love for you to get in touch with us if you have any questions, or if you just want to learn more. We have the contact information for how to reach out to the ITS Digital Accessibility team. We also have monthly office hours where you can just drop in and ask us any specific questions that you might have. We also have a digital accessibility community of practice that meets monthly and provides updates and conversation about current digital accessibility issues. And if you had questions specifically related to compliance and some of the laws and regulations we talked about today, you can also reach out to the Disability Equity Office, who's one of our close partners in doing this work. So thank you so much for having me here today and for this conversation about digital accessibility.